You want to know one of the biggest contradictions in the Bible?
Lay it on me, bro.
Bring it!
You see, the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most important events in Christianity, and you would think that supposedly his disciples would have been present and they would have heard and seen the same thing.
For starters, Mark 14:50 says that all the disciples fled when Jesus was arrested.
I can smell the failure!
Mark and Luke were not direct witnesses, but were disciples of both Peter and Paul. Mark and Luke probably had an opportunity to interview other eyewitnesses apart from the 12 later. And John tells us that later he was near the cross with Jesus' mother and a group of Jesus' female followers.
But it's quite shocking that none of the Gospels can agree on what Jesus' last words were.
Oh boy. This is right out of the Bart Ehrman playbook of creating Bible contradictions. Step 1. Find two stories in the Gospels that are told differently, using different words, giving different details, naming different people, or emphasizing different things. Step 2. Claim that those differences are contradictions. Step 3. Step 4. Profit.
According to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' last words were, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit," and then he died. However, in the Gospel of John, his last words were simply, "It is finished," and then he died. But wait, it gets even worse. In the Gospel of Mark, it says that Jesus' last words were, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which is not only a contradiction, but implies that Jesus abandoned his faith in his last moments. Imagine the final words of who they see as God, and yet they couldn't get that right. So imagine what other details they must have completely messed up.
Okay, so what exactly is going on here? For starters, Mark 15:34 never says that my God, why have you forsaken me was Jesus' last saying, because it says, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last in Mark 15:37. Matthew gives us the same information. Luke 23:46 fills in the details of what the loud cry consisted of. He wrote, Jesus crying with a loud voice said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. If Jesus called out to the Father in a loud voice, as Luke says, but said, it is finished more quietly just as he breathed his last, someone farther from the cross could have heard the louder but not the quieter saying. The author of John, who explicitly says that he witnessed the soldier thrust a spear into Jesus' side shortly thereafter, could have easily been standing close and thus would have been able to supply the supplementary information. Once again, each item only takes a second or two to say, and the tiniest amount of real-world imagination combines these sayings really easily. But what about Jesus supposedly losing his faith? Well, it's pretty clear that Jesus is quoting Psalm 22, and in early Judaism, it was very common to invoke a complete psalm just by quoting the opening line. So to understand why Jesus is quoting Psalm 22:1, we need to read the entire psalm. Against the Jesus lost faith idea, Psalm 22:5 speaks of how those who trust in God are delivered and not disappointed. It reads, to you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. So this isn't at all about Jesus losing faith. Psalm 22 also seems to describe what happened at the crucifixion. For example, it says, I am poured out like water. This is certainly one way to describe someone bleeding out. All of my bones are out of joint. Well, in crucifixion, physicians tell us that one's full weight pulls down on their nailed wrists and both their shoulders and elbows dislocate. In this position, the victim's arms stretch to a minimum of 6 inches longer than their original length. It also says my strength is dried up, my tongue sticks to my jaws. Well, medical science tells us that with great blood loss, one becomes very thirsty. You lay me in the dust of death. All of these verses sound like somebody who's at death's door. Finally, Psalm 22 begins with the persecution and death of the king of Israel and ends with the pagan nations turning to God. At the end of the psalm, it says, all the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you, for the kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. So Jesus here isn't losing faith at all. These passages just are not a problem. Before claiming to debunk the crucifixion, which is a fact that pretty much every historian affirms, Taoists need to do a little bit less tick-tocking and a little bit more critical thinking.